What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to the channel.
Yo.
So, Nick, fighter pay has never been more of a hot topic than it is right now. This is on the heels of Francis Ngannou potentially walking away from the UFC as a champion. And now you've got Jake Paul going hard in the paint against Dana White all day, every day, except there's a difference now. He's now an investor in Endeavor. He has apparently bought a piece of the company. I believe it's publicly traded, so I'm sure he was able to just buy shares on the open market. And we know Jake Paul, he doesn't do anything if it's not going to get him some headlines. So now apparently he's an investor in the UFC, and he said that his intentions are to increase awareness and increase fighter pay.
Yeah, and to anybody out there who doesn't know what Endeavor is, it's the company that actually owns the UFC. So Jake Paul kind of now owns a piece of the UFC.
It's like owning a little bit of Apple stock. You
Right.
can go to your friend's house and say, hey, I'm an owner in Apple. But in reality, Endeavor's a multi-billion-dollar company. Jake owns a very small sliver of it.
Right, and I think that that's more of a publicity stunt. Jake doesn't miss when it comes to this sort of internet, what is it, clout catching. He knows how to just get his name all over the headlines everywhere, not just in the fight world now, but all over media in general. He's able to get his name out there, and it's really quite impressive. And to do these little things just shows how deep he thinks before he makes his moves. You have to study this move by Jake Paul, and then next time you see him do something, think about why he's doing it.
Yeah.
And this is all big plays. He's obviously trying to go after Dana in a bad guy approach, but acting as a good guy, right?
Yeah.
Like he's constantly feuding with Dana, but he's like, I'm only fighting with you on behalf of your fighters.
Right.
And so it goes with this weird thing. It makes Dana look like the bad guy, but Dana's really the guy that's been paying every single one of them for 20 years now, right?
Yeah.
So it's just a very funny dynamic. I think the feud between Jake Paul and Dana White is actually one of the most fascinating feuds in the entire sport. And of course, we're not going to see conflict to conflict resolution. We're never going to see Jake Paul and Dana White fight. But it is very interesting to watch a young guy who hasn't gotten the approval of the boys in the back and hasn't really gotten full approval of the legitimate tough guys out there going after the boss of all the tough guys. And it seems to me like he's gaining fans in the locker room with the fighters because he's going after Dana, and he's maybe saying things that they wish they had the cojones to stay.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I find it fascinating, and I can't wait to see just the entire evolution of the Dana White versus Jake Paul feud and see where it ends up. Because watch, I bet you at the end of the day, we're going to see some sort of handshake, some sort of embrace between those two. It might be when Dana's 10 years older than he is now. It might be when Jake Paul's long done fighting. But just keep your eyes out for that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find many 24-year-old kids who are more calculated and very well thought out in the way they behave and the way they do things. And yes, he does do things that annoy people. I have been guilty of it myself. I have turned on the TV. I have paid money that I've worked hard for to hope that he got knocked out, hoping T. Wood would knock him out. But at the same time, if I'm being honest, I think that bringing awareness to increasing fighter pay is a good endeavor. I think that him trying to actually become a good boxer and hone skills is something to be admired. I think he's demonstrated that he's a real fighter. Like, he's been hurt in a couple of fights and he's come back and fought through it. So I think we need to give Jake a little more credit than he deserves. And the fighter pay thing, it's always... The pay is one of those things in all sports that always lags a little bit behind the growth of the sport. So the sport explodes, the sport grows, and there's a bigger pot, and the fighters should theoretically be given, a bigger piece of that pot simultaneously as it's growing. But we know that in most sports that doesn't happen. As the sport grows, it takes a little time for the fighter pay and compensation to really rise to that level as well. So I think that the UFC is not going to be able to get away with continuing to do the 10 and 10 as the minimum contract. That will change, and it's just a matter of how soon will it change. And I don't discount the fact that Jake Paul might actually be a catalyst in this. Dana White said on the Nelk Boys podcast, the Full Send podcast, I'm not talking about Jake Paul anymore. This podcast is the last time I'm talking about Jake Paul. So we'll see if that's true now that he's invested in the company. I wonder if Dana will comment on that.
Yeah, and after he said that, they spoke about Jake Paul for another 10 minutes. And Dana's not the type of guy that is like, will just shut off completely and act like he's oblivious to Jake Paul. He's going to continue to talk about him at some level. He's just doing that because he knows Jake is trying everything he can to get in Dana's mind and to constantly be taking up real estate in the mind of the most powerful man in combat sports. And so far he's doing a good job, and Dana's the first one to admit it. He's like, man, why am I talking about a guy who I don't have signed, who I don't have fighting in my league, who I've never even met.
Yeah.
And he doesn't matter to me. I don't like him. I don't dislike him. I can appreciate what he's doing. I think he's a smart kid. He's hustling. He's doing what he's got to do. And as of now, he's becoming a more legit boxer than he was a year ago, 2 years ago, and 3 years ago. And if he continues to box, hey, there's plenty of money for him over in that world, but don't try to come over to my world and ruffle my feathers when I've been shown to make bigger increases both in the evolution of the sport, the growth of the sport, and the fighter pay than anybody's ever been able to do, not only in MMA, but in combat sports in general. Boxing is top heavy as far as the paychecks are concerned. And as of late, the top of the bill hasn't been getting their paychecks either. So I heard that Logan Paul is pretty angry with Floyd Mayweather because he's not getting paid. And you won't ever see Dana White have a fighter leave the venue without a paycheck. So I think that there's some truth to that. I think that boxing shouldn't be looked at as the knight in shining armor of paying people and being above board and respectable. But also maybe MMA does have some room to grow. And if you just look at the pay disparity between like the top athletes, the Tom Brady's of the NFL, and the bottom of the barrel guys, the number 60 guy on the roster or whatever, there's a very large difference. I mean,
massive.
Probably 100 times difference pay.
Or more, yeah.
Or more. You kind of have to understand that what you bring to the table is what you're also going to receive in return. And I think that Conor McGregor's well fully paid. And I also think that fighters under UFC contract that get 3 fights a year with the potential of making 20 grand each time just for the competition, and then they have some sponsorship deals. On top of that, they're all allowed to have other jobs and other forms of revenue. That makes for a very good living, especially in the time and world that we're in right now.
It does. And, you know, the dirty secret that's not a very well-kept secret about boxing is that they do have like a roster of 500-plus fighters like the UFC does. Let's like take Golden Boy, for example. But 385 of those Golden Boy fighters are fighters out of Tijuana, fighters out of Central America that have a 5-37 record that get flown up to fight for $500 on an undercard, that they're a huge underdog. It's a massive mismatch. A lot of times they get knocked out. Sometimes they get seriously injured. When you think of Golden Boy, you have Ryan Garcia. He gets paid very well.
Yep.
But Ryan also built a platform for himself before he came over to Golden Boy. Mm-hmm. When you think of Top Rank, you have Vasily Lomachenko. He gets paid very well. You have Terrence Crawford. He gets paid pretty well. Then there's a lot of guys on that card that are making $1,000, $1,500.
Yeah.
They're barely covering their coaches' expenses. A lot of them are living in the gym. So while, yes, if you're comparing the top to the top, Francis Ngannou to Tyson Fury, there is no comparison. Boxing pays substantially more, and the UFC stars probably are now at a level where they deserve to get paid a little bit more than they do now.
Yeah.
But when you look at the depth as a whole, it's not even comparable. You're seeing people who are making substantially less than poverty level wages to go and get beat up, essentially.
Yeah, and you know, Dana White does have the performance of the night type of bonuses, and oftentimes there's 4 people that get $50,000. It's performance of the night, knockout of the night, fight of the night, right? But there's been plenty of times that you can go to where Dana White's either upped the pay to $75,000 for a bonus, or and that's rare, but more frequently given more people, like 8 or so people, $50,000 extra. I don't think Oscar De La Hoya, Bob Arum, any of them have ever, shelled out a check for $50,000 extra bucks to somebody on the undercard.
Yeah.
And that's something that's very impressive, very cool. And the UFC is able to churn fights out week in, week out. They're always putting on fights at minimum. Last weekend was the 11 fights on that card.
Yeah.
And that was a light fight night.
Yeah.
So boxing has a long way to go. And like you said, the boys in the back in boxing are making a combined $1,000 between the two of them. And they're fighting 5 times a year, 10 times a year just to make literally below poverty line in America.
And that is the sad part about it that nobody wants to talk about, because you see, the guy from Tijuana that made $500 to come up and fight is not making the headlines.
Right.
Well, unless he gets seriously hurt in the fight, God forbid.
Yeah.
But what makes the headlines are Tyson Fury versus Deontay Wilder. Each of them are walking away with a $30 million bag.
Yeah.
And then Francis Ngannou, when it's all said and done, pay-per-view numbers and all that's going to make a couple $1 million, but substantially less than that. So that's what's being talked about. And rightfully so. I think there's a case to be made to increase that. But I think you have to look at the sport as a whole. And Dana made a point, because Oscar goes hard in the paint against Dana all the time, but Oscar's notorious for not paying people on time. Canelo's the biggest star in the sport. He left him. And you have these guys that fight on the undercard, as we said, that make no money. Dana was like, look, Volkanovski just fought.
Yeah.
He made more to wear the Crypto.com shirt than the entire rest of the card under the main event made on Oscar De La Hoya's entire Golden Boy promotion. So that was an undisputable fact that Oscar went pretty radio silent on and wouldn't respond to. And I didn't, this is not a video to beat up Oscar De La Hoya. He's just an example of somebody that criticizes Dana quite often, and he doesn't necessarily have the shiniest reputation himself either.
Right. And Jake Paul's doing cool things aside from advocating for fighters in a sport that he doesn't do, and the UFC fighters more specifically. He's also taken $1 million off of his paycheck and feeding it to all the people on his undercard, which I thought was very cool. You don't see a lot of boxers that make even more money than Jake Paul doing that. And if they do, they're definitely going to do it now. If they weren't doing it, they're going to do it now because they don't want to look like bad guys that are leaving with $10 million and there's a guy leaving with $1,000 and a horrible concussion. Jake Paul made sure it was fair. Maybe he's not able to give that guy $100,000, but he gave him $50,000, and that's something that's really cool. I think that Jake Paul's doing a lot of cool things for the sport and for combat sports in general. I think Dana White and him bouncing back and forth is only good for the sport because it's moving the needle. It's keeping both of them in the headlines. And even though Dana White says that he's done talking about it, I think there's plenty more chapters in this book that we have left to unfold.
I think you're right. Guys, I think the Jake Paul Dana White saga is just beginning. It is far from over, but let us know in the comments, what do you think? And what do you think about Jake Paul investing in Endeavor? We'd love to hear your comments below. And until the next one, have a wonderful day.
Peace.